The sentence that ended my job wasn't dramatic. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even directed at me. It was spoken casually, mid-conversation, like a scheduling note that didn't require emphasis. We'll need to terminate her position today. HR will handle it. I was standing just outside the glass-walled conference room, tablet tucked under my arm, waiting to be called in for what I assumed was a routine briefing. The door was half closed, just enough to carry sound without intention. No one inside knew I could hear them. No one lowered their voice. That was the first signal that this decision had already been normalized in their minds. I didn't step away. I didn't interrupt. I stayed still because something in the phrasing told me this wasn't about performance or timing or conflict. It was about removal. Clean, efficient, unquestioned. When the door finally opened, the expressions I saw confirmed it. Polite neutrality. Prepared posture. The kind people adopt when they believe the difficult part is already over. I was invited in and offered a seat across a long table that suddenly felt ceremonial. Legal was already present. That detail mattered more than anything else. This isn't personal, my boss said, folding his hands as if restraint itself were a courtesy. It's about alignment going forward. I nodded once, not in agreement but in recognition. Alignment is the word people use when they want inevitability to sound reasonable. HR referenced restructuring language. Legal referenced risk review. None of them referenced my work. No one needed to. The decision had already been framed as structural, which meant responsibility had been abstracted. I listened without interruption until the conclusion was stated plainly. My role would be eliminated effective immediately. I would receive a severance package consistent with policy. Access would be revoked by end of day. The tone was controlled, confident, almost relieved. They believed they were closing a chapter. Who assumes accountability after today? There was a brief pause. Not confusion. Hesitation. Legal answered first. Your responsibilities will be redistributed temporarily while leadership evaluates longer-term solutions. Temporarily is not a designation, I said. It's a gap. My boss smiled thinly. We've considered that. Consultants can fill the interim. I nodded again. Consultants advise, I said. They don't hold authority. Another pause. This one longer. Legal shifted in her seat. You're no longer responsible for what happens after today, she said, as if that were reassurance. It wasn't. It was confirmation. I stood, thanked them for the clarity, and placed my badge on the table. No one tried to stop me. No one followed me out immediately. They didn't feel threatened. They felt finished. The walk back to my office was quiet in a way that felt intentional. People sensed change before it was announced. Conversations stopped when I passed. Screens went idle. I packed methodically, not because I was calm, but because I was precise. Precision had always mattered more than reaction. A colleague appeared at my doorway, pretending coincidence. He asked the question I knew would come first. Who signs off now? I answered honestly. No one. Not yet. His expression tightened. That shouldn't be possible. It is when the role is removed before the responsibility is reassigned. He didn't argue. He already understood the implications. The systems we worked within were designed around accountability, not optimism. Authority wasn't symbolic. It was embedded. When it disappeared, processes didn't fail loudly. They paused. They waited. That distinction mattered. I handed over my remaining access credentials and walked out without ceremony. Less than an hour later, my phone vibrated for the first time. A message from inside compliance. Dashboards frozen. No errors. Just frozen. I didn't reply. Another message followed from someone higher up. No. The next message arrived almost immediately. We can't restart the modules. I placed my phone face down and drove home. By the time I arrived, the pause had propagated. Transactions were queuing without clearing. Certifications were awaiting signatures that no longer mapped to an active authority. No alarms were triggered yet. The system was doing exactly what it had been built to do when responsibility was unclear. It was waiting. The first call came early the next morning. Senior leadership. Direct. Urgent without panic. We need you to come in temporarily, they said. Just to help us clear a few items. I declined. Not emotionally. Procedurally. I'm no longer authorized. That can be arranged, they said quickly. It can't, I replied. Not retroactively. Silence followed. Then a different tone. We're already missing settlement windows. That's expected, I said. Without designation, validation halts. Another silence. Longer this time. Clients are asking questions. They will, I said. They're requesting updated certifications. They should. We just need you to sign, they said. Informally if needed. There is no informal authority in these contracts, I replied. When the call ended, 3 more followed. Different departments. Same confusion. By midday, legal reached out. Not confident now. Calculating. They had reviewed the continuity language more closely. They had found the clauses they'd dismissed as outdated. They were current. They were active. They didn't require intent. Only conditions. Those conditions had been met the moment my role ended without transition. By late afternoon, finance was involved. Exposure estimates were being recalculated. Not hypothetical anymore. Confirmed. The next call included the board. Voices I had never spoken to directly before. Measured. Controlled. The number was stated without commentary. $1.1 billion. No one reacted audibly. Numbers like that don't invite emotion. Followed. They demanded a statement. My boss had submitted his resignation. Effective immediately. It was offered as mitigation. It wasn't. Leadership changes don't reset contractual execution. Systems don't recognize symbolism. They recognize conditions. The resignation had occurred after the triggers. Too late to matter. I said nothing. There was nothing left to explain. They asked if there was any discretion. There wasn't. Not by design. The call ended without resolution. That night, messages continued internally without me. Names disappeared from directories. Meetings were scheduled without outcomes. Press teams drafted statements that would never fully explain what had happened because the truth wasn't dramatic enough. No sabotage. No retaliation. Just alignment doing what alignment does when it's misunderstood. The next morning, I watched the reaction unfold from a distance. Market response. Client exits. Contractual enforcement moving forward clause by clause without urgency or apology. The system wasn't angry. It was precise. Hours later, confirmation arrived through a single sentence from someone still inside. His resignation didn't change anything. It wasn't supposed to. It never could. By the end of the first day, the narrative had already begun to shift inside the building I was no longer allowed to enter. The question was no longer why this was happening, but how no one had seen it coming. Meetings stretched longer. Language softened. Certainty evaporated. People who had spoken confidently the day before now asked questions they should have asked months earlier. Legal reviewed timelines obsessively, searching for a moment where intent could override mechanism. There wasn't one. The clauses didn't care about regret. They didn't respond to urgency. They executed when conditions were met, and the conditions had been met cleanly, predictably, and in full compliance with the very framework that evening from someone who had never needed my number before. The voice was careful, measured, already tired. We're trying to understand if there's any way to pause the cascade, he said. There isn't, I replied. Not once it's begun. He asked if I had anticipated the scale. I told him the scale was math, not foresight. When protections are triggered across interconnected agreements, they don't move independently. They follow each other. Silence filled the line again. This time it wasn't disbelief. It was recalculation. Overnight, the story outside the organization began to take shape. Analysts didn't know the details, but they recognized patterns. Sudden freezes. Withdrawals without public explanation. A leadership change framed as accountability. None of it stopped the execution already underway. By morning, confirmation arrived that multiple counterparties had exercised rights simultaneously. Not coordinated. Just aligned. That alignment was what made it irreversible. Midday brought another call. This one from legal again. But the confidence was gone entirely now. The tone was different. Collaborative. Careful. We underestimated the continuity design, she admitted. I didn't correct her. Underestimation was already evident. She asked if I would consider returning under a revised structure. I asked one question in return. Is authority clearly defined before responsibility is assumed? She hesitated too long. That was my answer. We're trying to limit further exposure, she said. Exposure isn't something you limit after execution, I replied. It's something you prevent beforehand. Another pause. She thanked me for my time. That phrasing stood out. Time was no longer something they could recover. Throughout the afternoon, updates filtered in indirectly. More exits. Additional enforcement notices. Internal messages attempting to reframe the situation as unforeseen. It wasn't unforeseen. It had been documented, reviewed, approved. Confirmation arrived that the board had accepted the resignation formally. No announcement followed. No internal statement explaining the sequence. Just removal. Quiet. Efficient. The way organizations handle liabilities once they can no longer defend them. The resignation satisfied optics, not contracts. By then, the number had stabilized. Not reduced. Stabilized. The damage was no longer theoretical. It had been counted, accepted, and logged. I slept that night without interruption. Not because I felt vindicated, but because nothing was unresolved. The next morning brought a different kind of call. Not from the company I had left, but from someone who had been watching from the outside. The conversation was brief. Direct. He asked what happens to systems when authority leaves without transition. I told him the truth. They pause. They wait. They protect themselves. He didn't ask why I had been terminated. He didn't ask about personalities or conflict. He asked whether those protections could be replicated. That question mattered. Over the next day, the fallout continued quietly. Internally, people stopped speaking about the resignation and started speaking about process. Externally, confidence eroded without spectacle. That erosion was more damaging than any headline could have been. Credibility doesn't collapse in public. It thins. Calls slow. Invitations stop. Trust becomes conditional. By the third day, it was clear the story would never be fully told in one place. Pieces would surface here and there, but the core truth was procedural, and procedure doesn't trend. Inside the organization, new interim roles were announced. Consultants were engaged. Frameworks were reviewed. None of it reversed what had already executed. Authority cannot be recreated retroactively. Responsibility doesn't reattach itself out of convenience. The system had already moved past the point where I received confirmation that the financial impact had been disclosed internally in full. No qualifiers. No optimism layered on top. Just acknowledgement. The same acknowledgement that had been missing when it could have changed something. I thought briefly about the moment I had overheard the decision that removed me. How casual it had sounded. How final. That tone had carried consequences further than anyone in that room had understood. By evening, the call stopped entirely. Not because things were resolved, but because there was nothing left to ask me that wouldn't require undoing a decision already executed. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't uncertainty. It was acceptance. The quiet that followed felt different from the earlier pauses. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was comprehension. Inside the organization, people began reconstructing timelines, not to fix what had happened, but to understand how it had been allowed. Language shifted again. Words like unexpected disappeared. Words like overlooked replaced them. That change mattered. It meant the narrative was no longer defensive. It was internal. Somewhere between the third and fourth day, I received confirmation through an indirect channel that the resignation had not contained what leadership hoped it would. There was no relief rally. No reset. It simply marked an end point. The contracts continued forward exactly as written, indifferent to the symbolism attached to his departure. Markets didn't wait for explanation. Clients didn't pause for remorse. They acted on rights they had been given long before any of this occurred. That was the part few people outside the process ever see. Enforcement isn't emotional. It's administrative. And administration moves steadily once activated. Late that afternoon, I was contacted again, this time not with urgency, but with restraint. The board wanted to know if there was any interpretation under which the continuity triggers could be challenged. They couldn't. Not without undermining the same protections those agreements were designed to provide. The question wasn't whether the clauses were fair. It was whether they were valid. They were. Silence followed, then a simple acknowledgement. Thank you for confirming. No apology. No persuasión. Just closure. That was when I knew the situation had fully crossed from crisis into consequence. The next call came from someone entirely unrelated to the fallout. A peer in the industry. He didn't reference numbers. He didn't reference resignations. He asked one question. Would you be open to a conversation? I said yes. When we spoke later that evening, he didn't frame it as opportunity. He framed it as structure. He described an organization that had grown deliberately, one that measured authority before assigning responsibility. He asked how I evaluated alignment. I told him alignment only matters when it's enforced consistently. Otherwise, it's just language. He listened. There was no rush in his voice. No urgency. Just clarity. Over the following days, the former company receded into abstraction. Updates arrived less frequently. When they did, they were no longer seeking input. They were reporting outcomes. Client by client. Exposure by exposure. The number didn't grow dramatically anymore. It didn't need to. Its existence was enough. Internally, leadership shifted. New titles appeared. Interim committees formed. None of it reversed what had already happened. Systems don't rewind. They progress until conditions change. And the conditions that mattered most had been locked in the moment my role was removed without transition. A week later, the market reaction settled into pattern. Analysts moved on. Attention drifted. The damage didn't repair itself, but it stopped being novel. That was the final stage. When consequence becomes background. When people stop asking how and start adjusting who had called earlier. The conversation was brief and precise. He explained expectations. Authority was defined explicitly. Transitions were non-negotiable. Compensation was discussed without apology or justification. No one flinched. That told me everything I needed to know. Before we ended, he asked if I had any reservations. I had one. If responsibility ever becomes unclear, I said, I won't stay. He nodded. That's why we called you. Back at the company I had left, the name of the person who fired me faded quickly. There was no public reckoning. No internal memorialization of the error. He became a reference point used quietly in meetings, a reminder people didn't cite directly. His resignation didn't restore trust. It narrowed it. In environments like that, reputation doesn't explode. It contracts. And contraction is permanent. I didn't feel satisfaction watching that unfold. Satisfaction implies emotion. What I felt was recognition. The system had worked exactly as intended, just not in the way leadership had assumed. They believed protection was expensive. They believed redundancy was inefficient. They believed authority could be improvised. All of that belief collapsed under execution. On my first day in the new role, I was introduced without narrative framing. Just function. People listened. Not because of what had happened elsewhere, but because clarity had been established before responsibility was assigned. Later that evening, alone, I thought about the word that had been used so casually when the decision was made. Replaceable. It wasn't malicious. It was careless. Replaceable applies to tasks, not to accountability. Accountability requires continuity, and continuity requires respect for structure. If you remove the structure without replacing it, the system doesn't forgive you. It protects itself. What happened wasn't revenge. It wasn't even reaction. It was alignment correcting an absence. The resignation didn't cause the damage. It simply arrived too late to stop it. By the time it happened, the cost had already been counted.